So you want to run a D&D game, but you don't want to use one of the official D&D settings. You want to use your own. Well, you're in the right place because this is the first part of a 4-part video series on creating your first homebrew setting. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about scale and geography. How big do you want your homebrew setting to be? In future videos, we'll cover the history and lore of your setting, the politics and rulership, and the factions your players will find within it. But by the end of this video, I want you to have a clear idea of the size you want your setting to be and how to approach the geography and regions within that setting. If you like what I do here, please consider dropping a like on the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Now, how big should your homebrew setting be? A setting doesn't have to be an entire world, although it can be. A setting can be as small as a single city or town. It could be a county or a country, a continent, or an entire world. That's entirely up to you, and it's partly defined by the kind of campaign and story you want to tell in this setting. For example, if you want to have the players travelling from one side of the world to another, going on a long kind of Lord of the Rings-esque quest where they have to visit different continents, different biomes, different environments, then that's probably going to be something where you do want at least an entire continent, if not an entire world, for them to explore. That's one kind of setting. But you might want to run a smaller campaign where the players are fighting gangs, solving murders. It might all take place in a single city, in which case you really don't need to worry about the wider continent or the wider world. You take all your world building skills and energy and bring them down to focus on this single small area. Again, it just depends on the kind of story you want to tell. So if you have spoken to your players and you've thought about the kind of story you want to tell and it kind of demands a certain scale of setting, then that's the scale on which your setting should be built. Now let's say you want to go big. You want to create that vast sprawling world with multiple continents. Remember that you don't need to populate all of the different areas in that world with content and fully developed lore, because your players are going to start somewhere within that world and they're not going to be able to explore it all that quickly. Unless you give them some kind of fast travel device early on, they're never going to surprise you by suddenly jumping to the other side of the world to an area you haven't prepped. So yes, by all means create a huge sprawling world, but don't get too stressed out about having to develop the details of the regions far away from the player's starting zone. You just need to be concerned about the environment where the players begin and the areas that are immediately accessible from that initial starting zone. Over time, the players will kind of communicate to you what direction they want to go in, and you will start rendering and filling out the world as they move into it. Now, of course, you can go out and create all the lore you want for the other areas, but the essential stuff is just the stuff the players can see up front. For me, I like to create a general world map with individual countries named and a general sense for me of what is in those countries, roughly the climate, roughly the culture, but I don't go into the in-depth details of the political systems or the ancient hidden lore of every country, because it will take ages for my players to ever get there, if they ever do, because oftentimes players are going to kind of chart a course across your world and not really deviate into the other corners of it. They will see the little bit that is concerned with their quest and their story, but you don't want to end up creating content that never gets seen, or most people don't want to do that. So focus in on the areas you think your players are likely to see, and then develop the continent and the world in response to what the players do. Now, if you've spoken to your players and you know that they're happy to play a slightly more self-contained game within a single region or even a single large city, then you can get really granular with your world building and compress all the detail into one locale, where every borough of the city has its own deep lore, its own NPCs, shops and stores, factions and guilds, or even on a slightly larger scale, you can look at a small area like a county or a duchy and populate almost every sort of day's worth of travel with detailed content, because remember, you don't have to worry about what's outside of that area, so you can really pour your heart and soul into that one relatively small region. Now, that's my preferred approach because I like the players to come back to the same areas multiple times, meet the same NPCs, build relationships, build reputation. That's my kind of campaign, but that's not a necessity. The key thing is just for you to sit down and say, what size of canvas do I need to paint this picture that me and my players want to paint, and then that's what defines the scale of your setting. I want to talk now about the geography of your world, and I'm not talking about things like the placement of nations and borders, but more the coastlines, the mountains, the natural physical layout of your world. Now, this is kind of going to be a do's and don'ts section, so The first thing I want to talk about is irregularity. You want your landmasses to look chaotic, asymmetrical, and irregular. You don't want uniformity and straight lines. Now, appearing over my shoulder here is what I would consider to be a bad map. This is a map where the coastlines are too straight, and it doesn't look like this could ever naturally occur in the real world. For context, I made this map deliberately to look kind of bad. This isn't me trash talking some poor incarnate creator's map. So this map is bad for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there are no islands around it. Any kind of landmass is going to have thousands of little fragmented islands and sort of peninsulas that have become separated from the landmass all around its coastline, some more than others, but that's always going to be a factor. And if you don't have at least some islands scattered around your coastline, it's going to look like your island has just been dropped into the ocean and sat there unchanged ever since. Now, the coastlines themselves are far too straight. You want coastlines that zigzag in and out because tectonic plates have moved over time, creating different kind of structures, ridges of mountains that rise up out of the sea. You should never have this sense that someone just drew a line and that was where the land ended and the sea began. Another issue is this large sort of inlet that runs up the centre here. Now, that inlet is the sort of thing you do want to include, places where the land cuts in and the ocean runs, you know, in a sort of unusual shape into the land. But the problem with this is that, again, you would just never see this in the real world. Something like this should be kind of warped around the edges. It should go in and out with little fjords and bays and inlets, and there should also be lots of islands, because presumably something like this happened because over time perhaps some kind of glacier eroded the land here and the seawater flowed in, or perhaps the land subsided here and the water was able to get in, or perhaps these were two different continents that merged together. Either way, it shouldn't be this clean. Geography is messy and chaotic, and the more messy and chaotic your map looks, the more realistic it's going to look. Now, here's an alternative map, and this is one that I use a lot for my own games. It's the continent of Centaurus, which I made up myself, and it's very irregular. You can see that no part is really like any other part on the map, and that's because that's how real continents are formed. There will be areas where tectonic plates have ground together, thrown up mountains, and that's created maybe a string of islands cutting off from one side of the landmass. There are bays which are formed because of the impact of meteorites or the glaciers that have moved through there and then created dells which have been filled up with salt water. I know nothing about geography, but I can look at this and say this looks more realistic than the other alternative. A great way to get better at creating realistic landmasses is just to look at the map of Earth and draw particular areas in something like Incarnate or by hand and turn them into your own versions of fantasy settings. For example, Greece is a fantastic place to start if you want an example of a really fragmented, unusual looking piece of land. I actually made this map based on Greece. You can see it basically kind of copies Greece exactly, but I turned it into an island by just making the northern border of Greece the northern shore of this island. And suddenly you get something that looks and feels like a realistic landmass as opposed to something that the DM hastily sketched out before the game. Another thing to consider is the temperatures and the different biomes you have playing out on your continent or in your world. And this is something that if you want to go for quite a stylized kind of classic fantasy feel, maybe disregard this next part, but if you want to go for something a little bit more immersive and quote-unquote realistic, think about trying to avoid hard shifts from one climate to another. It's unlikely that you're going to have a jungle sitting right next to a desert. More often than not, you're going to have a slow, gradual shift from soft green lands and kind of damp pastures going slowly into a slightly drier, warmer climate, going slowly down towards deserts far to the south. You're never going to have a point where the players move across a borderline and suddenly switch from the green shire land into the frozen wasteland. There's always going to be more of a sense of gradual shifting as the players travel. Again, that's not an essential element, but it's something that I find is a little bit more immersive for the players to slowly get the sense that they're moving towards the different climates rather than suddenly switching between poles. Now, at this point, you should have an idea of the size you want your setting to be based on the story you want to tell in that setting. Is it a small a very gritty human story based in a single city? Is it a globe-trotting, save-the-world epic spread across an entire world or a giant sprawling continent? You also want to have a map which is based on realistic geography, the idea being that this map shows a world which formed very slowly over eons, as opposed to being quickly drawn out by the DM a minute before the campaign began, even if that is actually what happened. We now want to break that setting down into regions. Now, if this is a city, we're talking about neighborhoods and sort of boroughs within the city. If this is a country, we're talking about the continents and districts within the country. And if it's a continent or a world, we're talking about nation states and countries. Now, to decide where you're going to draw the boundary lines between areas, look at your map and see if those boundary lines are almost inherently written into the map already. Lines of mountains, a coastline, a naturally occurring river, or a shift between one plateau and a lower plateau. These are the sort of things that can naturally form boundary lines between nation states and regions. If it's within a city, you might look at the different areas based on the kind of businesses that naturally occur in the different areas. So, for example, one area might be defined by where the kind of long line of factories and foundries end. Another area could be defined by the fact that there's a high hill where all the temples have been built. Well, that naturally becomes the temple district of the city. There may already in your map be inherent boundaries that you can build around, but there will also be borders which have been formed for other reasons. Not all borders are naturally occurring. Some are, hard lines. You can look at the states, the state lines in America, in the United States, or you can look at the lines of different districts in Australia, and you see these very hard, unnatural lines. And that speaks to the past. You can look at it and say, I can see how this was essentially divvied up by committee, and that is something that's going to be wedded to the history of your world. So as you're drawing the border lines of your world, you're also thinking about the history. Who drew these lines? Is the line a sort of ragged back and forth defined by various incursions during a long fought border war? Or is this the lines drawn up, the clean straight lines drawn up by the domineering victor who has decided what the new world is going to look like? When you're drawing border lines, especially on a national scale or a continent-wide scale, you can really have some fun wedding them to your history. The big bonus that comes from breaking your world into little regions is that it makes it more manageable for you as a DM and for the players. If you have a single giant nation or a single giant continent without clear borderlines, you will end up never quite knowing where your prep has to stop and start. Instead, if you have it all broken down into a patchwork of clearly defined areas, you always know what areas you need to prep. You're prepping whatever area the players are currently in, and the ones that are just around it that the players could easily get to maybe in a session or two. Beyond that, you don't have to worry. You can fill those areas in as your players approach them. Again, we're looking to create a setting that is, sure, it's developed, it's worked out to an extent, but it's not so developed, or it doesn't demand so much development that you end up having to spend years of your life doing world building instead of just playing D&D. As you develop the countries of your world, the counties of every individual nation, the boroughs of a sprawling city, what you're going to be doing is developing the history of your setting at the same time. How do these boroughs and these districts and these countries come to have the names that they have, the flavour and the feel that they have? That is the history and lore that's going to start developing. So having kind of done the practical groundwork of developing your geographical setting and dividing it up into these areas, we're now moving towards history and lore, which is something we're going to cover in our next video. Anyway, I hope that was a useful introduction to this topic of homebrew settings. I was originally going to do one big long video where I basically covered everything you need to know to do a homebrew setting, but I realised that would take way too long and be far too long a video. So instead we're doing the 4 parts. Next time we're going to talk about history and lore. After that we'll talk about governance and politics. And then finally we'll talk about factions, rival factions that can exist within your world and that players can join. Anyway, I hope the video was useful, and I will see you in the next one.